The morning of March 15, 2024 started like any other at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Dr. Margaret Chen, a 34-year-old curator specializing in military artifacts, was methodically sorting through boxes of recently donated materials from the estate of Colonel William Harrison's family. The upcoming exhibition, Guardians of Empire, America's Military Evolution, was just 3 months away, and every piece needed careful evaluation. Another box of photographs, Margaret muttered to her assistant James Rodriguez as she lifted a dusty cardboard container marked military, missed 1900-1910. The climate-controlled storage room smelled of preservation chemicals and old paper, a scent she'd grown to associate with hidden treasures. James, a recent graduate student with an infectious enthusiasm for historical mysteries, peered over her shoulder as she carefully removed layers of tissue paper. "What do you think we'll find this time? More routine portrait shots?" Margaret's latex-gloved hands paused as she uncovered a large photograph, approximately 20 by 16 inches, mounted on thick cardboard. The image showed what appeared to be a massive military formation, hundreds of uniformed soldiers arranged in precise rows on what looked like a parade ground. A handwritten notation in faded ink at the bottom read, "Imperial Guard Formation, Fort McKinley, May 1903, 1,250 men. This is unusual," Margaret said, her voice dropping to the hushed tone she reserved for potentially significant discoveries. "Group photographs this large from 1903 are extremely rare. The logistics alone would have been..." She trailed off as she held the photograph up to the LED examination light. What she saw made her breath catch. The image quality was extraordinary, far beyond what should have been possible with 1903 photography technology. Individual faces were crystal clear, even in the back rows. She could make out uniform details, facial expressions, even what appeared to be cigarette butts scattered on the ground near the front row. "James, look at this," she whispered, pointing to a soldier in the third row whose mustache was so sharply defined she could count individual whiskers. "This level of detail, it's impossible." James squinted at the photograph. "Maybe it was taken with one of those large format cameras. I've seen some impressive results from..." "No," Margaret interrupted, reaching for her magnifying glass. "Look here." She pointed to a soldier's uniform buttons. "You can see the eagle embossing on each button. And here," she moved the glass to another section. "This soldier's eyes are so clear you can see light reflecting off his pupils. This is 1903, James. Camera technology couldn't capture this kind of detail, especially not at this distance and with this many subjects." The room fell silent except for the hum of the climate control system. Margaret felt her heart racing, the same sensation she'd experienced 5 years earlier when she'd authenticated a previously unknown Civil War battlefield photograph. But this felt bigger. "We need to get this digitized immediately," she said, carefully returning the photograph to its protective tissue. "And I want high-resolution scans, the highest our equipment can produce. If this image quality is genuine, we're looking at something that could rewrite what we know about early 20th century military photography." As they prepared to transport the photograph to the digitization lab, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple military group photo. The soldiers' faces seemed to watch her from across the century, their expressions frozen in time with a clarity that defied historical explanation. Little did she know that within 48 hours, this single photograph would attract the attention of photography experts from around the world, launch an international investigation, and connect living families to ancestors they thought were lost to time forever. 2 days after the discovery, the Smithsonian's Advanced Digitization Lab buzzed with unprecedented activity. Dr. Chen had called in favors from colleagues across 3 continents, and now the small, sterile room housed some of the world's leading experts in historical photography analysis. Dr. Erik Lindqvist, a Swedish photography historian from Stockholm's Royal Institute of Technology, hunched over a high-resolution monitor displaying the digitized image at 400% magnification. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "In 43 years of studying historical photography, I have never seen anything like this," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the weight of professional disbelief. Beside him, Dr. B. Sarah Kim, from MIT's Department of Imaging Science, ran her fingers through her black hair, a nervous habit she'd developed during graduate school. "The grain structure is all wrong for 1903, he muttered, pointing at the screen. "Look at this section here, the tonal gradations in the shadows. This level of detail requires silver halide crystals that weren't developed until the 1920s at the earliest." Margaret stood behind them, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she watched the world's foremost experts systematically demolish everything they thought they knew about early photography. James sat at a nearby workstation, frantically taking notes and coordinating with researchers who were joining the investigation virtually from London, Tokyo, and Berlin. "Show them the uniform details," Margaret said quietly. Dr. Lindqvist clicked to a section focusing on a sergeant in the front row. The image revealed not just the man's stern expression, but the individual threads in his uniform fabric, scratches on his belt buckle, and even what appeared to be a small scar above his left eyebrow. "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Francesca Romano, connecting via video call from the Vatican's photographic archives in Rome. Her image flickered on the large monitor mounted on the wall. The depth of field alone would require lens technology that didn't exist until decades later, and the exposure time needed to capture 1,250 people without motion blur. Dr. Kim pulled up a comparative analysis she'd been running. "I've been examining similar group photographs from the same period. Here's a West Point class photo from 1904, considered exceptional quality for its time." The image showed perhaps 200 cadets, but their faces were soft, details were limited, and the overall quality was markedly inferior to the mystery photograph. "There's something else," James interrupted, looking up from his laptop. "I've been researching Fort McKinley, where this photo was supposedly taken. The base was established in 1901 in the Philippines, named after President McKinley after his assassination. But here's the interesting part. I found references to a special equipment testing division that operated there between 1902 and 1905. The room fell silent. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of special equipment?" "That's where it gets mysterious," James continued, scrolling through digitized military documents. "The records are heavily redacted, but I found mention of advanced optical reconnaissance systems and experimental imaging apparatus for strategic military applications. There's also a reference to a German optical engineer named Wilhelm Brenner, who was contracted by the US military during this exact period." Dr. E2 Lindqvist leaned back in his chair. "Brenner, I know that name. He was a pioneer in lens design, worked with Zeiss before the war, but his work was classified, theoretical. Most historians assumed his advanced designs were never built." "What if they were?" Margaret asked, the pieces beginning to form a picture in her mind. What if this photograph wasn't just a military formation picture, but a test of a revolutionary camera system? Dr. Romano's voice crackled through the speakers from Rome. That would explain the extraordinary quality. If this was a prototype military surveillance camera, it would have been decades ahead of commercial photography. The military always had access to technology years before it reached civilian markets. Sarah Kim was already pulling up technical specifications on her tablet. A military optical system in 1903 could theoretically have achieved this quality. Large format, custom lenses, experimental chemical processes. It's possible if someone was willing to spend enormous resources. James discovered something else in his research. "There's more. I found a shipping manifest from 1903 showing delivery of specialized optical equipment to Fort McKinley, shipped from Carl Zeiss in Germany. Weight, 2,200 pounds. For a camera system, that's massive." The investigation was revealing far more than anyone had anticipated. What started as a simple photograph authentication was becoming evidence of a secret military technology program that predated known advances in photography by decades. "We need to examine the physical photograph more closely," Margaret decided. "Microscopic analysis of the emulsion, chemical dating of the paper and mounting board. If this really is from 1903, there will be physical evidence." Dr. Lindqvist nodded gravely. "And we need to identify these soldiers. If we can verify their identities and service records, we can authenticate not just the photograph's age, but its location and circumstances." As evening approached in Washington, D.C., the team had transformed from skeptics to believers. The evidence was mounting that they had discovered not just an extraordinary photograph, but proof of a secret chapter in military technological history. The faces of 1,250 soldiers, captured with impossible clarity, were no longer just subjects in an old picture. They were witnesses to a forgotten experiment that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in 1903. Margaret stared at the central figure in the front row, a young captain whose intense gaze seemed to look directly through the camera lens and into the present day. Tomorrow, they would begin the painstaking process of identifying these men, unaware that their investigation would soon connect the present to the past in ways they never imagined possible. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, the Smithsonian had transformed into the epicenter of an international genealogical investigation. The photograph, now officially designated as the McKinley Formation document, had been shared with military historians, genealogy experts, and facial recognition specialists around the world. Dr. Chen sat in her expanded office, now cluttered with printouts, family trees, and correspondence from descendants. The story had broken in the Washington Post 5 days earlier, and the response had been overwhelming. Her desk held over 200 emails from people claiming connections to soldiers in the photograph. "Margaret, you need to see this," James called from his workstation, where multiple monitors displayed genealogical databases and military records. "We've confirmed the identity of Captain Thomas Hartwell, the officer you've been studying in the front row." Margaret hurried over, her excitement barely contained. "Tell me." Captain Thomas Hartwell, 24 years old, from Portland, Maine, served with the 15th Infantry Regiment in the Philippines from 1902 to 1904. But here's the incredible part. I found his great-great-granddaughter. She lives in Seattle, and she's been researching her family history for years. On James's screen was an email from Rebecca Hartwell Morrison, a 34-year-old software engineer who had been searching for information about her ancestor for over a decade. Attached to her email was a small, damaged daguerreotype, the only photograph her family possessed of Captain Hartwell. Margaret's breath caught as she compared the two images. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same strong jawline, the same intense eyes, even the same slight scar above the left eyebrow that Dr. Lindqvist had noticed in the high-resolution scan. "She's flying in from Seattle tomorrow," James continued. "She says she's dreamed of seeing her great-great-grandfather's face clearly her entire life." The success with Captain Hartwell had opened floodgates. Dr. Sarah Kim, now working full-time on the project, had developed a facial recognition protocol specifically adapted for historical photographs. By comparing bone structure, facial geometry, and distinctive features, they had begun matching soldiers to family records with remarkable accuracy. "We've confirmed 12 more identifications," Sarah announced, joining them at James's workstation, including Sergeant Michael O'Brien. His great-grandson is a retired police officer in Boston. "And Private First Class Antonio Rossi. We found his family through Ellis Island immigration records." Margaret picked up one of the printouts showing Private Rossi's section of the photograph. The young Italian immigrant's face was captured with such clarity that they could see the hope in his eyes, the carefully groomed mustache he'd probably spent hours perfecting for the photograph. "Each face tells a story," Margaret murmured. "These weren't just soldiers posing for a routine military photograph. They were participating in something they probably didn't even understand, a test of revolutionary technology that would preserve their faces for future generations with impossible clarity." The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. James answered and immediately gestured for Margaret to take the call. "Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Patricia Williams from the Army Historical Foundation. We've been following your investigation, and we've uncovered something significant in our classified archives." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What did you find, Colonel?" "We located the operational records for the Special Equipment Testing Division at Fort McKinley. You were right about the German optical system. Project Argus, that was the code name. Wilhelm Brenner's camera system was indeed tested in May 1903, exactly when your photograph was taken. Project Argus, named after the Greek mythological figure with 100 eyes. The system was designed for long-range battlefield reconnaissance. According to the records, it could capture clear facial detail at distances up to 500 yards, revolutionary for 1903. The test required a large formation of soldiers to evaluate the camera's ability to simultaneously focus on multiple subjects at varying distances. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place. So our 250 soldiers weren't just posing for a photograph. They were unknowing participants in a military technology test. Exactly. The project was classified and eventually discontinued when the technology proved too expensive and complex for battlefield deployment. The camera system was dismantled and all records were sealed. Until now, we thought no images from the test had survived. By afternoon, Rebecca Hartwell Morrison had arrived at the Smithsonian. Margaret watched as the Seattle software engineer stood before the high-resolution display, showing her great-great-grandfather's face in unprecedented detail. Tears streamed down Rebecca's cheeks as she reached toward the screen. "I've been searching for him my whole life," she whispered. "Our family lost almost everything in a house fire in 1963. This damaged daguerreotype was all we had left of him. I used to stare at it as a child, trying to imagine what he really looked like." Margaret handed her a magnifying glass. "Look at his eyes. Look at the expression on his face." Rebecca studied the image intently. "He looks determined. proud, like he knew he was part of something important. She paused, wiping her eyes. "What's that in his hand?" Margaret looked more closely. In Captain Hartwell's left hand, barely visible but clearly captured by the extraordinary camera system, was what appeared to be a small piece of paper. "James, can you enhance this section?" Within minutes, they could see that Captain Hartwell was holding what appeared to be a letter. The paper was folded, but part of the handwriting was visible. Sarah's imaging software revealed the partial text. "My dearest Tom, the baby," Rebecca gasped. "That has to be a letter from his wife. Family records show they had their first child in 1903. He was reading a letter from home when this photograph was taken. The discovery was more than historical. It was profoundly human. The revolutionary camera system hadn't just captured faces and uniforms. It had preserved intimate moments, personal details, and human connections across more than a century. As word spread about the successful identifications, more families came forward. Each confirmation brought new stories, new connections between past and present. The photograph was no longer just evidence of forgotten military technology. It had become a bridge across time, reuniting families with ancestors they thought were lost forever. Standing before the massive display screen that evening, Margaret realized they had uncovered something far more significant than a historical mystery. They had discovered that even the most advanced technology means nothing without the human stories it preserves. The faces of 1,250 soldiers, captured with impossible clarity in 1903, had reached across 121 years to remind the present that the past is never truly gone. It's simply waiting to be rediscovered. The McKinley Formation document would become one of the most significant historical photographic discoveries of the 21st century, but its true power lay not in its revolutionary technology, but in its ability to connect human hearts across the vast expanse of time.